Welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today we are diving headfirst into social psychology.
Yeah, it's all those, often unseen forces influencing us, our thoughts, feelings, actions, especially when we're around other people.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. Your whole day is just filled with navigating social stuff, making these quick judgments, reacting.
hmm And we're here to kind of unpack the core principles behind all that.
We've got some great material you shared, and the plan for this deep dive really is to pull out the most valuable bits.
The really applicable insights, right? Give everyone a bit of a shortcut to understanding these, well, pretty fundamental aspects of why we act the way we do with others.
Totally. So our mission, if you will, is to explore how we form those initial impressions, why we think people do what they do, attribution,
The causes.
and just how much the social context, the environment shapes what we do and even what we believe.
Okay, sounds like a plan. Where should we kick things off? Impressions.
Yeah, let's start there. How do we even begin forming an impression of someone?
Well, impression formation. It's that initial process, isn't it? Building an overall picture based on, well, whatever info we have.
And some of the really foundational stuff here, it comes from Solomon Asch, right?
Absolutely. His work is key. What's really striking is how certain bits of information seem to carry way more weight than others.
That's his research on central traits, isn't it? Just fascinating.
Yeah.
He did that study, gave people lists of adjectives describing someone, and just swapping out one word, cold or warm.
It completely changed the perception. It's wild.
Yeah. Like the number of people thinking the person was generous just skyrockets when you use warm from like 10% to 90%.
Really shows the power, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And he found other words like positive or blunt. They just didn't have that same punch.
So warm and cold are like these core anchors for how we judge someone.
Precisely. Ash argued they act like a lens, We interpret everything else through that initial warm or cold feeling.
But that's not the whole picture, is it? There's also this tendency to be swayed more by the first things we learn.
Ah, yes. The primacy effect.
It absolutely rings true. First impressions, they really do stick.
They do. Even if later info contradicts it, that first take just seems to set the scene.
Why is that, though? Is it just laziness?
Well, partly it connects to something called confirmation bias. Once we start forming that initial idea, we tend to notice and even actively look for stuff that confirms it.
Right. So if I think someone's friendly early on, I'll notice all the friendly things they do and maybe ignore the times they're not so friendly.
Exactly. It's like our brain is wired to find evidence for what we already suspect. It acts like a filter.
Blinding us sometimes, maybe? Or things that don't fit our initial idea.
It can, yeah. Reinforces those beliefs, even if they're maybe not quite accurate.
And it's not just about people, is it? The material mentioned how this applies to other beliefs, too.
Oh, definitely. Like in therapy, for instance.
Right. If a therapist really believes in one technique, they might just focus on the research that backs it up.
And kind of unconsciously ignore studies suggesting other things might work better or even work just as well.
Man, it really makes you think, how often are we doing this in our own lives? Holding on to some initial idea and just looking for the proof.
It's a constant process, which kind of leads us nicely into attribution, doesn't it? How we explain why things happen.
Yeah, figuring out the causes. Fritz Heider called us naive psychologists, right?
Yes.
Always trying to make sense of behavior.
That's the term. We're all trying to be detectives in our own social world.
And he made that key distinction, dispositional versus situational attributions. Can you break that down simply?
Sure. Dispositional is internal. It points to the person's personality, their traits, maybe their motives.
So like, my coworker missed the deadline because they're disorganized. That's dispositional.
Exactly. You're blaming their character, essentially. Situational, on the other hand, looks outside the person, external factors.
Okay, so they missed the deadline because their computer crashed, or they had way too much work piled on them.
Precisely. External circumstances.
Seems straightforward enough, but we're not always fair about it, are we? The sources mention some biases.
Oh, yes. Biases creep in all the time. The big one is the fundamental attribution bias.
Right. What is that again, exactly?
It's our strong tendency to overemphasize those dispositional factors when explaining other people's behavior.
So we jump to conclusions about their personality.
Pretty much. Someone cuts you off in traffic, you think, what a jerk.
Instead of maybe, wow, maybe they're rushing to the hospital or something.
Exactly. We default to character flaws for others.
But interestingly, we don't really do that for ourselves, do we?
Not nearly as much. And that brings us to the actor-observer effect.
Okay, actor
Where
vomit.
it's so when we're the actor doing the behavior, we tend to blame the situation more.
I was late because the traffic was insane.
Right. But if someone else is late for the same meeting,
Ugh, they're always so unreliable. We blame them.
exactly. It's about what's salient, what stands out. When we act, the environment stands out. When we watch someone else act, they stand out.
That makes perfect sense. Our perspective literally shifts the explanation.
And then there's one more very related bias that's all about protecting ourselves.
Ah, the self-serving bias. Gotta protect the ego.
We got it. We take credit for our successes.
I aced that test because I studied hard and I'm smart. Internal factors.
Yep. But when we fail,
Oh, the test was totally unfair, or the professor hates me. External factors.
it's a way to maintain that positive self-image. We all do it to some extent.
Oh, absolutely. I can definitely see myself doing that. It's almost automatic, that little mental flip.
It really is. So yeah, these biases really color things. Oh, speaking of biases, there was that question in the material about Albert slipping.
Ah, yes. The slipping example. Let's quickly unpack that.
Okay, so Albert slips and blames the slippery floor that's situational.
Right. External factor.
But then he sees someone else slip and thinks, wow, they're clumsy. That's
Dispositional, blaming their inherent clumsiness.
exactly. So which bias does that perfectly illustrate?
That's gotta be the actor-observer bias. Explaining our own actions situationally, others dispositionally.
Spot on. And just quickly, why not the others? Confirmation bias.
Nah, that's about seeking confirming evidence, not explaining falls differently.
Self-serving bias.
Doesn't quite fit either, because that's about success versus failure for ourselves. This is comparing self versus other.
Good. And hindsight bias is that knew it all along thing.
Mm-hmm.
So actor-observer fits perfectly.
Great clarification. Okay, so we've talked about how we see people, how we explain their actions. But why do we even, hang out with people in the first place? Affiliation and attraction.
Yeah, let's shift there. Affiliation, that basic drive to seek out others.
It feels pretty fundamental, doesn't it? Like an innate need for connection.
It really does. And Schachter's research linking anxiety and affiliation is quite telling.
Oh, the misery loves miserable company idea.
Exactly. When we feel anxious or stressed, we often prefer being around others going through the same thing.
Why is that? Just for comfort.
Comfort, validation, maybe social comparison checking if our reaction is normal. It helps us cope.
Makes sense. We feel less alone in it. And what about Eysenk's theory? About arousability?
Right, linking introversion-extroversion to affiliation. The idea is that introverts might have a naturally higher level of arousal.
So they seek less stimulation, including social interaction, to avoid getting overwhelmed.
While extroverts might have lower baseline arousal and actively seek out social engagement to reach their optimal level.
That fits a lot of common understanding, doesn't it?
It seems to resonate.
Right.
And the sources probably mention gender differences too. Women tending to affiliate more in conversation that tend and befriend stress response.
Right, as opposed to just fight or flight. And what actually draws us to specific people? Attraction factors.
Well, the basics often include competence. We like capable people.
Sure.
Some similarity liking those who are like us in attitudes, values.
Definitely. And reciprocal liking. It's nice to be liked back.
Can't argue with that one. These are pretty foundational elements.
Okay, so turning inward now.
Mm-hmm.
What about our self-concept? How we see ourselves?
Right. Our understanding of me, the idea of self-schemas is useful here.
Self-schemas, like mental frameworks about ourselves.
Exactly. Interconnected generalizations built from past experiences. They help us organize and process information about ourselves.
So if I see myself as athletic, that schema influences how I interpret my performance in sports, maybe even what activities I choose.
Precisely. It filters and guides self-relevant thinking. And then there's that quirky thing called the Barnum effect.
Oh, yeah. That's a fun one, where we totally buy into vague general personality descriptions.
Like horoscopes or those generic online quizzes.
You have a great need for other people to like and admire you? Well, yeah. Who doesn't?
Exactly. They seem so personal, but they could apply to almost anyone. We just readily accept them, especially if they're positive.
Yeah.
Named after P.T. Barnum, supposedly.
There's a sucker born every minute. Fits. Okay, what about self-perception theory?
Ah, that's the idea that sometimes we figure out our own attitudes or feelings by watching our own behavior.
So we infer our internal states from our actions, especially if we're unsure how we feel.
Right. If internal cues are weak or ambiguous, You notice you keep donating to environmental causes, so you think, I guess I must really care about the environment.
You learn about yourself by observing yourself, like an outsider might.
In a way, yes. And this connects really well to those Schachter-Singer epinephrine studies. Remember those?
Oh, definitely. The ones about emotion, they're pretty mind-blowing.
Weren't they? So people got epinephrine causes physical arousal or a placebo.
Right. And some were told what to expect, some weren't, some were misled.
And then they were put in a room with someone acting either really euphoric or really angry.
And the key finding was, if you felt aroused but didn't know why.
You look to the situation, to the other person's behavior, to label your own feeling.
So if the other guy was happy, you felt happy. If he was angry, you felt angry.
Exactly. It showed that emotion isn't just physiological arousal. It's arousal plus a cognitive label we often get from our environment. We look for cues when we're unsure.
Wow. Okay, so we've looked at perceiving others, perceiving ourselves. Let's get into how we actually influence each other. Social influence.
Right, a huge area. We could start with the different bases of social power, the ways people get others to do things.
Okay, power dynamics, let's run through them.
First up, coercive power. That's influenced through threats or punishments.
Like a parent threatening to ground a teenager or a boss threatening to fire someone.
Exactly. Then there's reward power, the opposite, using rewards or positive incentives.
A bonus at work, praise from a teacher.
Yep. Next is legitimate power. This comes from someone's role or position.
Like a police officer, a judge, a CEO, their title gives them authority.
Correct. Then referent power. This is based on liking, admiration, respect.
So we're influenced by people we look up to or want to be like. A charismatic leader, a role model.
Precisely. Then expert power, based on knowledge or skills.
Like taking advice from a doctor or mechanic because they know more than we do.
Right. And finally, informational power. This comes from possessing specific, needed information.
Like an eyewitness having unique details about a crime.
Exactly. And often, these power bases overlap, don't they?
Yeah, the sources mention that. Like a good therapist might have expert power.
From their training.
But also referent power if the client trusts and likes them, makes their influence stronger.
Definitely. Now, what about when it's not the powerful majority influencing things, but a smaller group? Minority influence.
Yeah. How can a minority sway the majority? Moscovici's work.
That's the key research. He found minorities can be influential, but it really depends on their style.
They need to be consistent, right? And confident.
Consistent, clear, confident, but not rigid or dogmatic. If they stick to their guns calm and consistently, they can create doubt in the majority view.
And the type of change is different too, isn't it?
How?
Well, minority influence can lead to more genuine, internalized change. Like, people actually come to believe the minority view.
That's right. It often leads to actual acceptance, whereas majority influence might just get you compliance.
People go along outwardly, but don't really change their minds deep down.
Exactly. It's a crucial difference. Now, on the flip side, sometimes we actively resist influence.
Oh, yeah. Psychological reactance.
Tell me about that one.
That's when you feel your freedom is being threatened. So you push back. You do the opposite of what someone wants.
Like the pushy salesperson making you want to run away.
Totally. The harder they push, the more you resist, just to assert your autonomy.
It's that desire to maintain control. And then we have to talk about obedience to authority. Milgram's studies.
Ah, yes. Powerful stuff. And controversial.
Very. Driven partly by trying to understand terrible historical events like the Holocaust. How could ordinary people participate?
And even with ethical debates, the findings are still so relevant, aren't they? Remind us of the basic setup.
Okay, so participants thought they were teachers in a learning study. Another person, the learner, actually an actor, was supposedly getting shocked for wrong answers.
And the teacher was told to keep increasing the shock level by an experimenter, an authority figure in a lab coat.
Right. Even when the learner protested, screamed, eventually went silent.
And the shocking part was,
how many people went all the way, administering the highest shock levels far more than anyone predicted.
Just because the authority figure told them to continue, it's chilling.
It really is. And Milgram found situational factors matter too, right?
Yeah, like obedience dropped if the learner was closer, or if the experimenter gave orders by phone, or if it was in a less prestigious building.
So the context really shapes the power of authority.
Yeah.
Okay, let's switch gears. Attitude change. How do our opinions shift?
Lots of theories here. First one that comes to mind is cognitive dissonance.
Classic theory. What's the core idea?
It's that uncomfortable feeling we get when we have inconsistent thoughts, or when our behavior doesn't match our beliefs.
Right, that mental tension.
Yeah.
And we're motivated to reduce it somehow.
Yeah, by changing the attitude, changing the behavior, or finding some way to justify the inconsistency.
Like in that famous boring task study.
Oh, right. People did a super dull task, then were paid either $1 or $20 to tell the next person it was actually fun.
And the ones paid only $1.
They ended up actually rating the task as more enjoyable later.
Why?
Because $1 wasn't enough justification to lie. So to reduce the dissonance between task was boring and I said it was fun, they changed their attitude. Actually, maybe it wasn't that bad.
Exactly. Insufficient justification leads to attitude change. Okay, next theory. Social judgment theory.
This one's about how our current attitude acts like an anchor, right?
Affecting how we receive new messages. Tell me about the latitudes.
Okay, so you have a latitude of acceptance messages here seem reasonable, maybe persuasive. A latitude of rejection messages here get dismissed. And maybe a latitude of non-commitment in between.
And what happens if you feel really strongly about the issue? High ego involvement.
Then your latitude of rejection gets way bigger. You dismiss almost anything that doesn't align perfectly with your view. And the latitude of acceptance shrinks.
Makes sense. The more invested you are, the harder you are to persuade with opposing views. Okay, then there's the elaboration likelihood model, ELM.
Right, the two routes to persuasion, central and peripheral.
Explain those.
Okay, central route is when you're really thinking hard about the message, focusing on the arguments, the evidence, high effort.
And you use that when
the topic matters to you and you have the time and ability to think it through.
And the peripheral route.
That's low effort. You're not really analyzing the arguments. You rely on cues. Like, is the speaker attractive? Do they seem like an expert? Are there lots of arguments, even if they're weak? Mental shortcuts.
And when do we use that route?
When we're not motivated or distracted or just don't have the energy to think deeply. Like maybe deciding which brand of soda to buy based on a celebrity endorsement.
Good example. And which route leads to stronger, longer-lasting attitude change?
Yeah. The central route, definitely. If you've really processed the arguments, the change sticks better.
Makes sense. Now, what about the people involved? The communicator and the recipient.
Communicator credibility is big, right? Expertise and trustworthiness.
Absolutely. We're more persuaded if we think the source knows their stuff and is being honest.
But what about that weird sleeper effect?
Yes. What happens there?
The impact of a message from a low credibility source can actually increase over time. How does that work?
The idea is, over time, you might remember the message content, but you forget who told you. You dissociate the message from the initially untrustworthy source, so the message itself starts to have more influence later on.
Interesting. And for the recipient, there's inoculation, like a vaccine.
Exactly. McGuire's idea, how does it work?
You expose someone to weak versions of counter-arguments against their belief.
Like a mild dose of the virus.
And maybe help them practice refuting those weak arguments. Then, when they face a stronger persuasive attack later, they're more resistant, they've built up defenses.
It's a great analogy. Okay, let's move into maybe some darker territory, but also its opposite. Aggression and prosocial behavior.
Right, the spectrum from harm to help. Starting with aggression. The frustration-aggression hypothesis.
The original idea was pretty simple, wasn't it?
Yeah, frustration always leads to aggression, and aggression leads to catharsis, getting it out of your system.
But that turned out to be too simplistic.
Definitely. The revised view is more nuanced. Frustration increases the likelihood of aggression, but only under certain conditions.
Like when?
Like if the frustration feels unfair or intentional, or if there are aggressive cues around, like seeing a weapon.
Right. And the catharsis idea. Does venting actually help?
Not really, according to most research now. Sometimes acting aggressively can even increase future aggression, not reduce it.
Okay, what about de-individuation? Zimbardo's concept.
That's when being in a crowd or anonymous somehow makes you lose your sense of individual identity and personal responsibility.
Leads to reduced self-awareness.
Yeah, and it can lower inhibitions against behaving impulsively or even antisocially. Like in Zimbardo's hooded participant study, where anonymity seemed to increase aggression.
And of course, his famous Stanford prison study.
Oh yeah, a powerful, if ethically debated, look at how social roles can just take over.
Guards became punitive, prisoners became distressed and passive, all based on assigned roles in a simulated environment.
It really showed how context and roles can dominate personality, sometimes leading to shocking behavior.
But wasn't there a challenge to Zimbardo's view on de-individuation in the material? Something from social identity theory.
Ah, right. What was the alternative perspective there?
Social identity theory suggests that instead of losing identity in a group, your group identity actually becomes more salient, more important.
So you're not losing self, you're shifting from personal identity to social identity.
Exactly. You become more attuned to the norms and behaviors of that specific group. So the answer to that question highlighted that de-individuation can increase the salience of group identity, not just erase identity altogether.
Okay, interesting tension there. Now, let's flip the coin. Pro-social behavior. Helping others.
A much nicer topic. Where do we start? Maybe evolutionary explanations.
Kin altruism. Helping relatives to pass on shared genes.
That's the basic idea. Makes evolutionary sense to favor your kin.
But it doesn't explain everything, does it?
No. People help non-relatives all the time. Sometimes strangers, even at great personal risk. The theory has limits.
So what else drives helping? Social norms?
Definitely. Like the norm of reciprocity, help those who help you. Kind of a social contract.
Tit for tat. And the norm of social responsibility.
Right. The idea that we should help those who need help, regardless of future payback. A moral obligation, almost.
Okay, those make sense for broader helping. But what about bystander behavior? Why do people sometimes not help in emergencies? The Kitty Genovese case brought this up, right?
It did, though the details of that specific case are often debated now. But it absolutely spurred crucial research by Latane and Darley.
And they found reasons why bystanders might not intervene.
Yes, several key psychological factors. Pluralistic ignorance.
That's when everyone looks around, sees no one else reacting, and assumes it must not be an emergency, even if privately they're concerned.
Exactly. Everyone misleads everyone else by appearing calm. Then there's evaluation apprehension.
Fear of looking stupid. Like, what if I intervene and it's not really an emergency or I do the wrong thing?
Precisely. Fear of social blunder. And the big one, diffusion of responsibility.
Yeah. The more people there are, the less personally responsible any one person feels.
Exactly. Someone else will surely do something. The responsibility gets spread so thin no one acts.
It's kind of depressing, but understanding it is the first step, right?
Absolutely. And knowing these factors has actually led to interventions designed to increase bystander helping in various situations, encouraging people to take responsibility.
That's good to hear. Seeing how psychology can lead to positive social change. Well, we have covered a ton of ground today.
We really have. From first impressions and attributions, through relationships, self-concepts, social influence, attitude change, all the way to aggression and helping.
It's a whirlwind tour of social psychology.
Hopefully it gives you, our listener, a solid framework for understanding these fundamental pieces of how we operate socially.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about your own biases, how attraction works, why people conform or obey, it's all incredibly relevant to everyday life.
Absolutely. Understanding these principles isn't just academic. It can genuinely help you navigate social situations more effectively, understand persuasion, and just be more aware of yourself and others.
So maybe a final thought to leave everyone with.
How about this? Start noticing these things in your own life. When you form an impression, ask yourself, is the primacy effect at play? When you explain someone's behavior, are you falling into the fundamental attribution trap?
Or when you feel swayed by an argument, was it the central route or peripheral cues? How are you being influenced?
Exactly. Just observe your own social world through this lens. What factors are shaping your judgments, your interactions?
Becoming more aware of these hidden forces, it really can lead to greater self-awareness, maybe more empathy, and just, well, smarter social engagement.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's about understanding the currents beneath the surface of our social lives.